Hello, my name is Taylor Darcy with Darcy Law. I am an attorney for small businesses, startups, and entrepreneurs. I work with you to help you succeed. Today, we're going to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of an LLC. So, what are those advantages and disadvantages? Well, an LLC provides a liability shield for its members. So the assets that you have are or the assets that you invest into the LLC. So say you title a house or a piece of property into the LLC for it to be used. So you own a building and you want to contribute that as part of what you're doing. The only thing that can be taken by the LLC, typically, not always, but typically, is that property. So if you own a real property, so you own a house, because you do have rental property, which is highly recommended given tenants' likeliness of suing you. If something happens where you're sued and they attach to that home, that stays within the LLC. So one of the advantages is that I use a bubble reference in this case. A bubble of stuff that is in the LLC can be touched. The stuff that is out of the LLC typically cannot be touched. There are some exceptions, and I'll talk about that in a little bit. And that as one of the disadvantages. So advantages, your assets are limited, or your liability is limited to just what's in the LLC. Another advantage is that LLC gives you what's called pass-through taxation. A corporation has double taxation. An LLC, it's what's called pass-through. So that means that you're taxed at the same rate, whether you're a sole proprietor or whether you are taxed as an LLC. And that's really good because if you have a loss from one business, it can transfer over to to other income to help you reduce your tax liability. Now, I'm not a tax accountant. I'm not a tax attorney. So you would need to consult one of those, someone familiar with your situation, to decide and determine what's right for you. Another advantage to an LLC is that you can transfer the assets, or rather transfer the LLC as an easy transfer, relatively speaking, compared to like as an individual, as someone that just has those assets titled in their name. Imagine you have 10 cars. And as an individual, you own all 10 cars. Well, now you have to transfer all those 10 cars if you're going to sell the business. Versus if you have an LLC, then all those assets are titled in the business name. And so then you're able to just transfer the LLC, and those assets go along with the LLC. So it's quite a good selling point, right? If you're looking at building a business and you wanted to be able to sell it at a later time, or transfer it to somebody else, whether it's sell or transfer, it's the easiest way to do it, or one of the easy ways to do it. It's a simple contractual obligation. It takes very little time. Now, I mean, you do have to do due diligence to make sure everything's fine, but as far as like the actual transaction itself is relatively simple. And so you don't get that as a sole proprietor. You don't get that if you're doing business as something. You only get that if you have a business entity such as an LLC. An LLC also has the advantage of being an actual business entity. There are a lot of more stable, if you will. Imagine if you had to do business with, would you rather do business with somebody that's formalized it, set up the proper structure, gone through the work to make sure that it's correct, versus a sole proprietor that just starts taking money and sets up a business license? That isn't to say that one is quote unquote better than the other, but from a standpoint of trying to decide who you would do business with and not just purchase their services or products, but as far as like when you're looking at, is an LLC going to be around a long time? Now, one of the main disadvantages, at least in California, I don't know about in other states, is that we have the Franchise Tax Board has a minimum tax for an LLC, and it's $800. So it's not a lot of money, but it is some money, and so there's a threshold, typically around $24,000. If that's what your annual revenue is. If you're just doing it for simple tax purposes, that's about the amount where it makes sense to do an LLC from that perspective. Now, it makes sense from doing it from the day one so that you don't forget. I've had clients come to me before where they thought they did something and they didn't do that thing, and then they ended up getting screwed because of it. And then the other reason is that it's good to get it just done, and then you don't have to worry about doing it at a later point. So you can just move on, because otherwise what will happen is if you start with the if you start without it, then you have to get everything retitled into its name. And so from a continuity perspective, it makes a ton of sense to start from the beginning and do it right, so that you can then eliminate the likeliness that you won't do it at all. Another one of the or a disadvantage to an LLC is, and this is or potentially disadvantage, is that you're not 100% protected. There is nothing, and I have to be very clear on this one, that eliminates your liability. This only limits your liability. And that's very important, because if you, and again, I'll talk more in the corporate video later, if you do a certain things, like for instance, if you're using an LLC to commit fraud, or if you are undercapitalized, which what that means is your assets are lower than your debts. Now, we're not talking, it has to be substantial. Then, and then the last thing, that if you use your LLC as your personal piggy bank, what does that mean? That means that you pay your personal rent with your LLC funds. You pay your personal credit card with your LLC funds. Then the company, or then what they can do is called what's piercing the corporate veil. And I've talked about this in my other videos, but this is kind of one of the disadvantages of an LLC, in the respect that it's not completely bulletproof, right? It's not 100% free from liability. You still can hurt yourself if you make poor choices with your business. It isn't just an automatic get out of jail free card. So you have to consider that as a disadvantage, because it's not perfect. Versus with the sole proprietor, you're going to be unlimited liable for everything, right? And so you just know that that's on the hook. Versus on an LLC, you might be on the hook, and that's a big might, because they don't pierce the corporate veil regularly. It's not a common occurrence, but if you treat it with those three instances that I mentioned, if you treat it like that, then yes, it can happen, and you can be on the hook for the debts of the company as well as the other. Another disadvantage is you do have to keep an operating agreement. You do have to do the things that are required of it. Get an EIN number, get a business license. It's a lot simpler to do a sole proprietor or a DBA. That's just the reality. But it doesn't provide you with protection. So that's one of the advantages. These are all just, the pros and the cons of doing LLC versus a sole proprietor. Another potential disadvantage is, depending on your tax situation, as I mentioned earlier, you may want to do, your income tax will change. And again, this is a question for a tax attorney, not for me. But your income tax may change depending on whether you can do an LLC. Now, the good news is, and I'll talk about this at a later video, is that an LLC can actually elect to be what's called an S Corp, can be taxed as an S Corp. And we'll talk about that more later. Again, my name is Taylor Darcy. I am an attorney. I work with small businesses and startups. I hope to help you. Leave any comments, questions, or whatever down below, and I'll be happy to answer them for you. Hope you have a great day, and if you find me, feel free to look for me on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, you name it, I'm there. Have a great day. Bye.